Gretchen Bercaw, I congratulate you on producing the finest education possible for your children. What did Gretchen do? No, it wasn't necessarily Harvard. No, it wasn't necessarily Oxford. Gretchen and their father took their children, their 3 children, on a 4-year round-the-world sailing trip. They sailed the 7 seas, literally and figuratively. Sean, Katrina, Mary Kay, how lucky you are to have traveled and experienced cultures both diverse and exotic. And they have continued that kind of life even now. Sean is a tall ship captain, those gorgeous tall ships that we see. He attended Northwestern University, and he's a professor of nautical science. He sailed to Pitcairn at age 10 and returned at age 40. Funny you don't look it. You look like a kid. Katrina spent her sweet 16th birthday on Pitcairn Island, and Mary Kay is a professor with a specialty in Herman Melville. How appropriate for being at sea. Well, we imposed on the family to please talk to us about this trip. Those of you who were fortunate enough to be at the conference in 2007 heard from Katrina and Sean, and now we're going to hear more. I'm so excited, and thank you so much to the Bercaw family for being here with us and for sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you. So I found out last night I'd be doing this talk today, so I had 12 hours to prepare. What I'm going to be focusing on is that, as was mentioned, my family's had the luxury of actually 4 visits to Pitcairn Island over the last 50 years. And one of the things that's exciting about visiting an island like this is that you get snapshots of the evolution of the island. And especially being a sailor, I'm interested in the access and the egress to the island, really focusing on Bounty Bay. So you'll see some pictures of our visit there, but also, more importantly, I think the evolution of the technology of getting on and off the island. And I put this picture up because 4 of the people pictured here are in the room today, and then actually Morella over on the right there, she's about my age, she's about 12, I think, but she'll be speaking to us tomorrow by Skype. And I also put this picture of my father. He's passed away now, but just there to the left of Katrina, his name is Jay, and you'll learn that Jay Warren, pictured here in the center of this photograph, is actually named after my father. And I threw this up here. We all know about where Pitcairn is, but I think it's easy to forget just how isolated it is, especially after today's Skype. You know, it's like, oh, it's right there by Skype, but actually it is still quite far away. Even by modern transportation methods, it's still a little bit of a hike to get to Pitcairn Island. And it's because of that isolation that access and egress on the island is so vitally important. And Irving and Exie Johnson, they sailed around the world 7 times in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And my father sailed in this vessel with them. He was first mate aboard the Brigantine Yankee, and he sailed to Pitcairn Island in 1951. And at that stage, when they came into Pitcairn, of course, they arrived there by sail, and this is looking at Pitcairn Island from the Yankee. And back then, the longboats were either propelled by oar or by sail. And talking with some of the older Pitcairners when I was there in 2002, they said anytime there was more than one longboat out on the water, it was a race. So we could see that happening here, you know, that, I mean, not that competition is important as long as you're the first vessel there. That's all that really matters. And these fellows, they were very, very good operators of these longboats. Looking down on Bounty Bay, you can see it's evolved a little bit now, the pictures we've seen recently of what it looks like. Looking down, and this actually ties in what Kari said in her speech this morning is that you can see there's very, very little protection there in Bounty Bay. Looking down, you can see the longboats and the rocks there, which actually had names, Mommy and Daddy. And here, some Pitcairners call this Bounty Bay. I would call this a Bounty Beach, because there's really no protection to speak of there. So we've heard a lot, and we'll hear more over the next couple of days about Bounty Bay, but even it's come a long way from where it used to be. One of the things about Pitcairn, this was in 1951, was that there was a lot of manpower on the island. The island population back then was right around 150 people. So you'll see in these pictures that operations on the island required a lot of manpower. Here, the longboats are pulled up on the waves, but they had no big winch to pull them up, but they did have the manpower to actually get these longboats up out of the water. And here they're putting the boat to bed after going out to the Yankee. Going out through the surf, they had a big cruise to row the longboats. I've talked with different people who were there, and they talked about one of the fellows was a fellow named Robert Johnson, Irving Johnson's son, and he said when he was there on one of the later voyages, he was a strapping young lad, very, lots of big muscles and stuff, but he said when he rowed with the Pitcairners, he felt like a little weakling because the Pitcairners really knew how to propel their longboats. Here going out through the surf, and I threw this picture in. It's nothing spectacular in one sense, but yet you can see that the Pitcairners were just, rowing the longboats was part of how they operated there. And we heard from Leslie earlier that, Pitcairn Island, the population's too small to sort of have slackers, that everybody has to be contributing to make things happen. And that was true in propelling the longboats in this era, is that it was they just knew it had to be done. And I just recently read Herb Ford's book talking about Pitcairn Island Port of Call. And one of the things that really comes out is just how the Pitcairners, they'd be willing to row, 3, 6, 9 miles out to see a passing ship. So it's really a big part of their existence there. And one of the things that also comes out, and we heard it today during the Skype conversation with Pitcairn, is the goodbyes are a big part of the island existence. And here, the Brigand Yankees just about to leave Pitcairn Island, and the Islanders are just in the process of getting ready to sing the Sweet By and By as they took off. And I think if you talk to anybody who sailed to Pitcairn, it's wonderful to go there, but leaving the island is always hard, and there's always that poignant moment, and the Islanders make it even more poignant with their song. Whoops. So my father sailed on this voyage. He decided that would be wonderful to sail to Pitcairn and around the world with his family as crew. He and my mom had this crazy idea. They saved for 18 years. And as a 10-year-old, I didn't think it was crazy. It's like, oh, of course we're going to sail around the world. But, looking back now, they sold everything we owned, our house, our cars, and we sailed off with a boat and a savings account and came back 3.5 years later with a boat. So this was the first mile of some 37,404 miles we sailed going around the world. And we wanted to stop at Ducie Island, but Ducie, this is what we saw when we got to Ducie. We couldn't actually really see the island because of the surf, but we knew it was right behind the surf. So we wisely chose to not try to go ashore there. You can imagine why. But then we did go on to Pitcairn Island. And coming up to Pitcairn, it took us about 29 days to sail the 2,800 miles from Galapagos down to Pitcairn. And we came into the island, and we sailed there in our 38-foot sailboat, and the Pitcairners came out in their 37-foot longboat. So, it was a foot shorter, but not much. But you can see that technology's evolved. The longboats are still made out of wood, but now, instead of being propelled by oar, they're actually propelled by power. And so the Islanders came out in their longboats and came alongside. And looking down on Bounty Bay, and we heard a little bit about this morning as well, there is a little bit of a jetty that was built by the Pitcairners there. So there's a little bit of protection, but still not a lot of protection there. You could see looking, looking right there, you can see there's the longboats, but there's the surf right there, and the white water is coming around the end. And, there's surf there. So there's there is protection, but protection in the most general sense of the word. And being the wooden longboats, they had engines in them, but they still require a lot of maintenance, especially when you take wood and you keep it in a hot tropical environment. You always have to maintain those vessels. And one of the things here, we haven't heard too much about it, but there's no taxes on Pitcairn Island, but there are public work days. And so the islanders here have gathered to caulk the boat, to keep her watertight. And this is an ongoing process. And there at Pitcairn, they keep the longboats out of the water, especially the wooden ones, both for the welfare of the boats as far as the surf, but also because of the Toledo worms, which live there in the tropical waters, and you don't want those to get into the longboats. So here the crew are doing maintenance on the Pitcairn longboat. And to get the longboat into the water, the big crew, they all get around, and this was this is one of the magics of Pitcairn Island, having been there twice now, is that they all get around and they're sort of chatting. Pitcairners like to talk and tell stories and jokes and all. And they're all sort of joking around, and it's like, okay, 1, 2, 3, nothing might happen. And then magically, they know how this works. I don't know how it works, but magically, all of a sudden, they all decide to pull at the same time, and the boat goes sliding down into the water. And this happened to be a cargo ship with some cargo for the island, so they were launching all 3 longboats. So here you can see there's actually 2 already in the water, and the third one has been launched. So they keep them up here in the shed, slide them down. One of the things you can see here, for those of you who've been there more recently, is the Hill Difficulty Road goes up here to the right of the shed. Later on, this has been shifted around where the road comes around this way. But at this point, this is 1972, the road's going off there to the right. But you can see once again that the surf is right there to go out. And so these are the wooden longboats, but it's still sort of treacherous times. And Purvis, who at the time when we were there in 72 was the chief magistrate on the island, what would be the island mayor now, he was steering the boat as we went out through the surf to get out there. They did have rudders for the longboats, but going out through the surf, they used the steering sweep, and then once they were outside, then they stopped the longboat, and they pulled the sweep in and put the rudder in to operate that longboat. So we took off, and then I went off to high school and college, and all of my parents, my mother and father, they sailed back to Pitcairn in 1987. Just the 2 of them sailed there all the way from San Diego right down to Pitcairn Island. And they got there, and looking at the island as they came up to it, this is looking at Bounty Bay. And I put this picture in especially for the Pitcairners here in the audience, because I think it looks a little different now with what's happened. From my understanding, some of this hillside no longer is up there. It's slid down a bit, I believe. So when I put this show together last night, I was thinking about who was in the audience and specifically including some pictures for our different clientele here in the room, if you will. So looking at Bounty Bay, you can see it's evolved a fair amount. I mean, it's not too much different from more recent times. So once again, this is 1987, actually December of 87, almost 1988. The longboat shed. One of the big changes is just actually a few days before the arrival of my parents. Tin had been there, but tub arrived, and the longboat tub. And the Pitcairners were eager to sort of try her out, and Morella had made it to Mangareva, but there was she'd been waiting for quite a while trying to get back to Pitcairn Island. So a little deal was made between the Pitcairners and my parents, where they would take Tub, and my parents would go with their family boat, and Natasha as sort of the escort vessel over to Mangareva. Just wisely, it made sense not just to send the longboat off on its own. So they took off, and Tub here, you can see she's a motor vessel, aluminum motor vessel, but she also has a sailing rig. And so this was early in her years, sailing on over to Mangareva, and that's where this picture is taken. You can see, obviously this is not Pitcairn in the background, but rather Mangareva. So she went over there, and they stayed a day or so picking up Morella, and then they came back to Pitcairn Island. And this was right around Christmas 1987. And they came back, and then conditions were pretty rough, but Jay came out with a small rubber boat, put Morella in that, and took her to shore to get her in from that voyage. So I had told Mavis, when I was there as a 10-year-old, when you're 10, you say a lot of things, and I said, I'll come back one day. And years later, about 20 years later, she said, well, we're still waiting. She wrote me a letter and, when are you coming? You said you were going to come back. So it took me 30 years, and then when I was 40 years old, I made good on that promise. And I went back to Pitcairn. We tried to sail there, but took a 40-foot yacht with a friend. Unfortunately, got a crack in the hull and started sinking. And so we had to abandon that expedition. And instead, I flew down to New Zealand and jumped on a cargo ship on the American Star and went to Pitcairn that way. So I came into the island. And of course, this is 2002, so time's passed. And now they have the mosses there as well. So, suddenly tin is like almost, it's the little cousin. And these are the other longboats that they are using at this point. I'm a little bigger version than I was when I was there as a 10, but my Pitcairn parents, if you will, Jacob and Mavis are right there. So this was shortly after I arrived in 2002. Looking down on Bounty Bay, you can see it hasn't changed a lot since 1987, but one of the things that has changed is when I was there in 2002, the island population was about 42, I believe. And so the manpower to make things happen was just really minimal. And so here, one of the things you can see is getting the longboat down into the water, whereas in 1972, we had a lot of Pitcairners to get around to slide her down into the water. Here, the boat went partway down and stopped, and they had to bring the tractor down the hill of difficulty to help push her down into the water. But this was a ship up there in the dock. Right up there, you can see all the bags of mail getting ready to go out to this passing vessel. And they still had one wooden longboat stick, but this is up on a hill in her resting spot up there at this stage. So that's sort of my overview of Bounty Bay, but I also want to talk a little bit, about some of my other experiences. This is looking at the school. Right here, this little blonde head there in front, that's my head. I was lucky enough, that's what Mom and Dad kept telling me, to go to school when we were there in 1972. So I went to school with the kids for a week. But then when I was back in 2002, so 30 years later, I actually went to the school and gave a guest lecture. And so this is Ariel, where's DB? He's back there, yeah. So I put this in specifically, and also there's another family that's been to school there. And one of the things I had done when I went there in 2002 was on a sabbatical for my teaching job. So I put together a website about Pitcairn, about this voyage to Pitcairn. And they'd recently gotten that internet connection on a minimal level, but connected up, so they were able to download that website right there in Pitcairn Island and then post it there at the school. And one of the things I wanted to just briefly hit on today, we've heard references to this, but is sort of the evolution of technology on the island. When my father was there in 1951, this was a saw pit. This was the way you made big pieces of wood into smaller pieces of wood. It worked really well, but you didn't really want to be the guy in the bottom, especially on a hot day. You get all that sawdust right down on top of you. But this was the way things were done back then. By 1972, what had happened, this is a picture of Len, looking less gray hair back then, but using a table saw. This is one of the scariest contraptions in history. These teeth are about 1 inch long on this, and they use it to cut the wood. I really admire the Pitcairners, although I think they're slightly crazy using this machine, but it works great for for cutting the wood. And the carvings there, I was talking with some of the islanders. It's interesting on Pitcairn because I really think that now the quality of the carvings you find, the modern Pitcairn carvings, if anything, is higher than the older quality. But the skill set to make these quality carvings is lower, because nowadays we have Dremel tools and all that, whereas in the days of old they would actually rough out the carvings with axes and pocket knives. Here, Jacob is using a file to rough it out. And then once they sort of roughed them out, they'd use broken glass, like Mavis here, to actually stream down, get rid of all the markings on the carvings. And so they produce these amazing carvings. But nowadays, with the Dremel tool, you could do the same sort of work in about half the amount of time. So I'm not taking away from the carvings, but it's just a different skill set, and it makes sense if you're trying to make a living that you would bring in the modern tools to do a more efficient, better job. And also, Jacob here, this was in 2002 when I was there. It was towards the latter part of his life, but he's still sort of the old school, making the carvings by hand. And I threw this picture in. This is one of the things that we've always admired as a family were the Hattie leaves. We heard about them this morning in a reference to Hattie, where they would hold the leaves. And one of the things you could see if you don't know how these are made is they actually have to hold them up as they paint them. Because if they actually lay them down as they're painting, the paint will actually go through the leaf and block the back side and wreck it. So it's almost like painting a silk screen. But this is, I think in the next few years, one of the skills we may see passing by the wayside. Just, it's as the island evolves, we're seeing a change in what's produced there. And we heard about the wheelbarrow this morning, as the local means of transportation on the island. The Pitcairn wheelbarrows are very, very unique design. They worked well for the island. And this picture was taken in 1951 when my father was there. You can see, sort of the taxi service there. And we also heard about this, that there was a lot of, if you need to get someplace in the 50s, you went by foot. If you needed to carry a load, you carry it through a stick over your shoulder. And so the islanders, they just naturally were in very, very good shape just by the nature of their lifestyle. When we were there in 1972, the motorcycles had come to the island, but they were still sort of arriving. While we were there, a cargo ship came with mini motorcycles. Here are the two Jays, my father Jay with his namesake Jay Warren on a motorcycle there. By the time I was there I forgot to mention this. So one of the things that also arrived on Pitcairn in 1983 was the bulldozer. And I won't tell the whole story here, but just this was delivered by airplane. Actually, C-130 flew over the top of the island, pushed us back out of the airplane with parachutes, and that's how they got this on, because it was too big to go ashore in the longboats. And it's a wonderful story. But on the island, now, when I was there in 2002, the quads were the way to go, and here you can see the family station wagon. There's actually one more person than you can see, because to the left of Charlene, there's a little fish crate with a little person, her smallest child, up in there. So there was actually the family of 5 all in that one vehicle. But of course, the reason that there's so much interest in Pitcairn is because of the people. When my father was there in the 50s, Park and Christian was still alive, and he was obviously a very important member of the ship's community. When we were there, of the island community, excuse me, when we were there in 1972, this is Brenda Warren, and she was displaying some of the local wildlife here in a very appropriate form. And then I put this series together. We are lucky enough to actually have a 50-year interaction with Warren. And here's Warren in 1951 when my father was there. And then on my sister's sweet 16th, Warren was the mayor, if you will, and he oversaw her birthday party. So this is Katrina's turning 16. When my mother and father sailed there in 1987, here's Warren and Millie. Looking pretty much the same, a little bit older. Unfortunately, Millie passed away in 2001, but I was lucky enough to be able to visit Warren when I was there in 2002. You could see the sparkle in his eye. And what's so wonderful to me about this was he was housebound at this stage. He really wasn't very mobile, but I was able to go and visit him, and it was only a few months after this visit that he passed away. So I was able to sort of close that loop, and our family had the luxury of a 50-year interaction with him. And Jacob, he was getting up there at this stage, but he was still out there fishing on the rocks, still connecting, doing his contributory. So Pitcairn is a very, very rugged place, but it's because of that isolation, that ruggedness, that it's connecting to the world, and it's an abundance of, if you go to the records, that they've always been very, very generous with their fruit, whatever they could offer to the world. But what it is, it's the island and the island community that connects with what we're about. And I think that's the magic of why this whole conference works. And I want to point out, it's sort of hard to tell in this picture, but right there, you have to have a little bit of imagination, but that's a little green dot. Because this is actually, I took this photograph, I'm very proud of it. This is a green flash next to Pitcairn Island taken from a Pitcairn longboat. So, and this was before the days of digital, so the chance of this happening were rare. Thank you very much.